Lucy looks into a wardrobe. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said goodnight to the professor and gone upstairs on their first night, the boys came into the girls' rooms and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet, and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time we were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund, "and who are you to say when I'm going to go to bed? Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I'll tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to the dining room and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms were beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along, and the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There'll be hawks. Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out to the window, you could see neither the mountains nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. "Of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in the rooms he had set apart for them, a long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in another. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1 it'll clear up in an hour or so, and in the meantime we'll be pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore in the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to an end of, and was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they led only into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected that they would. But soon they came into a very large room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor. And after that was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner. And there came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall and a door that led out to a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books, most of them very old books and some bigger than a Bible at a church. And shortly after that they looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure that it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it is very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. This must be a simply enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. I wonder, is that more mothballs, she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. but instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "This is very queer," she said, and went on a step or two further. Next moment she found that what was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, it is just like branches of trees," exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at nighttime with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it is a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. "I can always go back if anything goes wrong," thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood towards the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it and found it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And soon after that a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upwards he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet he had a goat's hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella, and the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked just as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a faun. And when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all of his parcels. "Good gracious me!" exclaimed the faun. Good evening to all. I hope you all can hear me well. I'm seeing a lot of chat. Wherever you're tuning in from, whether you're on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, or on Twitter, so grateful that you're here tonight. In fact, I am on quite a few different platforms this evening. Just so grateful for your presence. If you're even watching this after the fact, great to have you with us. I'm coming to you live from Columbus, Ohio, and currently on the campus of The Ohio State University. So grateful to be able to be back with you. It has been a long summer, and I know many of you have kind of kept in contact with me about when are we starting, what's going on, when's the next time we start up something, and so here we are. Here's the beginning, and I'm so grateful that you get to be part of this, whether you're tuning in live or you're watching after the fact. I hope you're excited for this. Last year, for those of you who might not know, we went through the Screw Tape Letters, and right before that we went through Mere Christianity, and here we are. The students here at Ohio State had chosen to do The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so with that in mind, I just want to ask you, tell me where you're coming from. Let me know in the chat or wherever it is. Let me know where you're tuning in from. And anytime you have questions or thoughts or ideas or things along the way, please feel free to add them in the chat. I'll do my best to keep up with them. Most likely I will be catching them after because it's live. And so I will do my best to interact with those as I can. I should also note that as y'all saw, for those of you tuned in at front, really at the beginning of this, before we go live like we are right now, I do have a recording of the chapters. One of the reasons why I did that this semester is because a lot of my students were telling me, look, sometimes we just got behind and didn't have time to catch up. And then I stopped and thought about it. Man, the chapters aren't that long. And so I figured I'd just do kind of an audio recording of them. And many of my students actually on their way over will actually say, hey, I was just listening to the podcast on the way over. There's so many that listen to podcasts, so I figured we'd do it that way. And so even if you haven't read the chapter, if you just come, typically it's going to be 10 minutes early. Tonight it was about 7 minutes is what it takes to read through these chapters. The longest so far that I think I've done is 10 minutes. And so just come 10 minutes early and I will play the audio for that. So that way you always feel like you're caught up with what we're about to discuss, what's about to happen, and you'll never feel behind. I hope that's a benefit to you. It's been interesting doing audiobooks. I've had to learn a lot about the recording process of audio and then also the editing. Figuring that out, but it's been fun. And so I've kind of figured that out along the way. So grateful to see all of my people from Tennessee tonight. There's just a lot of y'all from Tennessee that are tuning in. It's great. I know we have some here that are in Ohio. I know we've got people coming in from around the world. And if you haven't caught the news recently, we at Ohio State have kind of been in the news the last couple of days. It's been quite amazing what's happening. We had our student fair on Sunday, and at the student fair, we had over 500 contacts with students who wanted to follow up with our club, Buckeyes for Christ, but also for whether it was Bible studies or an upcoming seminar that we're doing on pain and suffering. And then later on that evening, some of the football players here on the football team have actually done something quite incredible, and there was just kind of this movement on campus of a lot of faith movement. And it's been really neat to see. In fact, there was 52 baptisms that happened this past week for the remission of sins on campus by some of the football players here. And so football season starts Saturday here, and already there's just this really neat momentum that's happening this semester. So please keep us in your prayers for that. It's been quite an adventure. So with that all in mind, let's dive into this incredible classic together. So here we are, down the rabbit hole we go for this study. I'm just unbelievably excited about all this. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Brandon Edwards. I am the campus evangelist here at The Ohio State University with the Buckeyes for Christ student organization. I'm also the college and young professionals minister at the Church of Christ on Fishinger Road. I've been here just over almost 3 years now. Love this work, love this church, love the campus here and the students and what we get to do each and every day. I am an academic at heart. I'm also a reader at heart. I love literature, and I love finding the connections between literature and especially the underlying currents that are always seem to be there. And this is one of the reasons why I like this type of study, is to see what the authors kind of played out, what they wanted us to catch from the inside. And so with that in mind, that's what we're going to do together. So The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the first published book in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia series. Though chronologically within the series, it's actually the second story. But it's always the one that everybody kind of talks about, that kind of begins with, because the other one was kind of a prequel that happens after the fact, but prior to the fact. And so it kind of starts off, even though it's chronologically second, it is the main one that people seem to know. It's kind of the beginning of the journey. And it's a fascinating book in and of itself. It was first published in, in 1950, and the background of it was kind of the inception, the idea for Narnia, and is often linked to a picture that came into C.S. Lewis's mind of a fawn carrying parcels in a snowy wood. He actually kind of says this in one of his writings where he noted this, and this imagery that kind of came to him, which kind of he later described, was then seen from where Narnia grew out of that. He was known for taking walks, and during these walks, he would have these imagery that would come to his mind, and off of that, he would then begin to write his books. Lewis began writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in the late 1940s. The book was completed in 1949 and then published in October of 1950. Heavily influenced by World War II. You see, the story is set during World War II, reflecting the time when Lewis was writing. The children in the book, evacuated to the countryside, mirrored the real-life experiences of many British children during the war. And this was kind of why and how so much of this would have resonated with the people of that day, because it was their way of keeping their children safe was to send them to the countryside. And here was this book specifically of children being sent for that very reason. And not only were they sent away to get away from the terrors and the horrors of the world, but then to create this magical place where things would come alive while still dealing with real life issues was a truly beautiful thing. So from an allegorical perspective, this in fact is actually seen as a heavily Christian allegory. Now, Lewis maintained that the Narnia books weren't allegory in a strict sense, but there was many Christian themes throughout it. It's evident. There's no way. In fact, Lewis kind of admits that to the end. Aslan the lion is often seen as a Christ figure, particularly in his sacrifice and resurrection. It's very hard to miss that. So much so that, and I'll get to that here in a second, but really when he gets down to it, beyond this dedication that he does, because he wrote this for one of his dear friends, dedicated to her. Her name was Lucy Barfield. In fact, names one of the children Lucy after, we believe, Lucy Barfield, who was the daughter of Owen Barfield, one of his close friends. This connecting point, though, and the reception was not very well received because of the overt Christian elements. That was part of it, is while he was saying, no, it's not really that, people were having a hard time not seeing all the overt Christian things within it. So yes, it was dedicated to Lucy Barfield, but at the same time, it was not really received very well at the beginning. But it has since then kind of gone on from there. So while didn't have a lot of awards starting off, it has become a beloved classic, often featured in lists of great children's literature. My own mother, who I believe is listening right now, also read this to us as children. I remember it very specifically. I love these books. I love the imagination and the worlds. I always wanted to dive into these places. I always wanted to be able to find a wardrobe and find myself into these new adventures and new worlds. There had been a couple of adaptations, BBC series in 1988, and there was also a film in 2005 that went over fairly well and it was a very good commercial success. Now, I can say that they are actually creating, Netflix is starting a series that was supposed to come out this fall, but it was postponed, that I believe is coming out next year, that's going to be actually like a mini drama series on the Chronicles of Narnia. I'm not skeptical. I'm always skeptical when it comes to when major corporations go out and make things, especially off of beloved books. And so I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that they will do it justice. They will do it right. If it's tied at all to the family, the Lewis family, and in fact it was his adopted son in essence, has held a tight control over not allowing a lot of freedoms to be taken with the Narnia books, that they have to stay true to the books. If that's the case, it could be a fantastic series. Looking forward to trying it out next year when it does come out on Netflix. It is my hope that they will do it justice, that it will stay with what it was meant to be. But as you all know, when you watch TV these days, that's not always the case. So my hope is they won't ruin it, that they will do it justice, because it's beautiful in and of itself. And I hope they will use the modern technologies that we have with AI and all these different things that can be used for good television to really bring to life these masterpieces from these 1950s. Now, one of the key components of why this was so well received and why it's continued to be well received is that Lewis wrote in a style that was accessible to children but rich enough to engage adults. Even as an adult, when I went back to read it again, I found myself going, "Oh man, I love this. This is awesome." Like I'd forgotten how many times he uses different terms. I was like, "Oh, that's just a fantastic use of that." The imagination is still stirred when you read this. And his use of myth and fairy tale elements was groundbreaking at the time in children's literature. It really was. But even so, for us now today, it still has incredible value. And it's truly beautiful from that. Culturally, the Narnia series, starting with this book, has had a significant cultural impact, influencing literature, film, and even theological discussion. The imagery of Narnia, particularly the White Witch and Aslan, have become iconic. They're used in fact in pop culture and the rest. There's references. I even saw a meme just today about preaching that specifically harkened from a verse from this book, where it says, they were basically mocking, was the sermon short? Short. The sermon's never short, but it was good. And it's a play off of a line from this very book. And here we are in 2024, and there's making jokes about it. And it's fantastic, and it's a culturally relevant even to this day. So we'll dive into some philosophical things before we get into the book itself. There's a moral premise, the nature of good and evil. And this is often referenced as dualism. So you have this story presents a clear dualism between good, which is Aslan, the Pevensie children, and the creatures of Narnia that are loyal to Aslan, and evil, which is the White Witch, her minions, and those who betray for personal gain. This reflects a traditional Christian worldview where good and evil are distinct in eternal conflict. Now, I would note that there's not eternal conflict between God and evil. There's eternal conflict between mankind and our sin, in that our sin separates us from God, but there is no evil going to win against God. There is no battle. In fact, if you look all through Scripture, when Jesus shows up and there's demons, there's no battle to be had. Jesus goes, go away, they go away. That's how it happens. One of the other key things that you find all throughout this is redemption. Characters like Edmund undergo a journey of redemption, illustrating that even those who have chosen wrongly can find forgiveness and change through grace and personal transformation. In fact, we see that this is why so many of the overt Christian themes that people bring up are so prevalent throughout this entire book. So this nature of good and evil, this dualism, one of the verses that kind of jumped out to me was Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. I've just finished going through a series on Daniel with the college students here, and I'm not surprised by sometimes our lack of understanding when it comes to the spiritual world. But I guess I'm shocked that we don't realize more that Satan is real, and that demons do seek to destroy, and that there are problems for us, ones who want us to fail, and we just don't spend time thinking about it. And so while dualism gives us this idea of good and evil, there's also this very real world from a spiritual sense of that there is God and that there are those who are against us in this world who want us to fail. And when it came to redemption, the verse that came to me is, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. We see that in 1 John 1:9. So also another key thing that we find here is sacrifice and redemption. Aslan's sacrifice, his voluntary death to save Edmund, is a direct allegory for Christian sacrifice. It's clear. There's also moral agency. Children's decisions throughout the story highlight the importance of moral agency, of being able to choose right for wrong, to do the things that you know to be right and to not do the things that you know to be wrong. And these choices to fight for Narnia, to trust Aslan, or to resist temptation underscore the moral responsibility inherent in free will. And so the verses that came to mind, obviously John 3:16, when you think of sacrifice, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. From the moral agency perspective, think of just Joshua 24. Choose for yourself this day who you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Now, all of us, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Paul writes that. And so all of us who have reached the point where we have chosen wrong, we still are offered redemption. While we have still choices ahead of us, we are always offered redemption to make our way back to God. So justice and mercy are also deep themes that we find throughout this book. This is often what I would reference as deep magic. The rules of Narnia, particularly the deep magic, represent a form of kind of cosmic justice. However, Aslan's deeper magic of sacrifice introduces mercy, showing that justice alone isn't sufficient and needs to be tempered with mercy. In fact, there's a lot of ways, and you can find this correlation between how the Pharisees would look at the Scripture and how Jesus looked at the Scriptures. It doesn't change the law. It didn't change the deep magic, the old law, but it does change the outcome when you have a sacrifice, when mercy is played itself out. And so from there you see, obviously, Romans 6, I mentioned that earlier, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. And then obviously you also have, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy, Matthew 5:7. So another thing that I love about this book is its concept of time and eternity. The way time operates differently in Narnia compared to our world touches on some philosophical questions about time, eternity, and nature of existence. This can be discussed in terms of how experiences in Narnia affect the children's growth and understanding of life. You have to know that when they go into Narnia and when they come back out, no time has passed, but they have lived entire lifetimes. And so their minds have been changed by the very perception of their experiences in this other world. And they come back and it's like they're just back and then they're there. And so this whole concept of time, of also the eternal nature of our souls versus the very temporal nature of our physical bodies, it's an interesting context to kind of look at these different things within the story. Then there's also mythopoeia, which is the role of myth in story. Lewis uses myth to convey philosophical truths, suggesting that stories can reveal deeper truths about reality. In fact, Lewis was a huge proponent of using mythology, and it shouldn't come as a surprise, as he was a teacher of ancient literature, that he would use myth and story to share narrative. Now, this isn't very different, in fact, of what you will often find with Jesus himself. Jesus will use what we would call parables or stories to share deeper meanings and deeper truths in a way that people could understand. And as Lewis was trying to reach children and to encourage them in reading and understanding, and then the moral philosophy and moral things, he used story to do these very things. So, let us begin. Lucy looks into a wardrobe. Now, my plan is not to read through the whole entire chapter live. That's why I did the video before. But I do have it on the screen, so if you wanted to go along with it, you can. But I am going to go to specific moments and kind of bring to light some specific things that are going on that I really wanted to highlight. So when these Pevensie children take off and they go into this nearest place, they're sent out of London to go and be safe, away from the bombings, away from the war, trying to go there. And there's an old professor that they're kind of introduced to, and he's there to help them out. And so just a little bit of a moral insight to this. The children's transition from a known war-torn world to an unknown, fantastical one mirrors the philosophical quest to find deeper truths or escape from the confines of one's current understanding. And if I can be honest with you, many of you might even be doing that this evening. That you may have a tough life and tough things going on and some really hard stuff that's happening. And it's really, maybe there's cancer and there's trials and tribulation and there's pain and there's suffering. And so you've dove into this book looking for a way just to something more, something different, just in the moment, just to find something a little bit, to calm your soul or to find some meaning in something. Maybe you yourself are doing the very thing that Lewis kind of gives us here by taking us away from our real life in the moment and allowing us this journey. Maybe that's why you're here. So here Lewis suggests that true discovery or enlightenment might require leaving behind a familiar, embracing the unknown, and reevaluating one's perception of reality through the lens of wonder and innocence. You know, one of the things that I got asked a couple of times is, why a children's book? Why are you doing this with college students, and why in this way? And I'll just be honest with you, because I think there's unbelievable value to be found in reawakening wonder, reawakening our sense of innocence, and reawakening our sense of remembering what it's like to go, wow, there's possibilities out there. There's something more than what I know of in this moment. And I think that's unbelievably powerful for us to spend time doing. And so what you're doing even tonight or whenever it is that you're watching, my hope is that this is something that is powerful to you, that it's a reprieve from the days and all the craziness out there, that you get an opportunity to just step back and reawaken wonder for a moment. That's my hope, at least, with all of this. And I do believe that's, in essence, the invitation of what's happening to these children. And so going forward just a little bit here, I want to get to a specific part. And one of the reasons I have all these slides is because I never know how long I want to go and what different parts I want to go. But here they've introduced themselves to these wonderful old man, and he is going to take care of them along the way. And the kids are arguing back and forth about what's upcoming and what's not. And I love that Susan calls him an old dear. He says, I think he's an old dear. Now, this is not a terminology we would use a lot these days. We wouldn't reference old people in that way. I'm not sure I would use a lot of the terminologies we use these days when it comes to people. But there's this affection to this man who takes in these children who are not his own, takes them into his home to take care of them during these trying times. Now, Edmund, even in this moment, is very precocious. He's very argumentative in some ways, and he was having a hard time not laughing at the old man. And just to be honest with you, I have my own brother in the rest. I can kind of see my own brother in this. And so, John, I'm sorry I'm throwing you under the bus in some ways here, that there's always one who's just a little bit more strong-willed, and Edmund kind of is that individual in this. And especially when I was one of 4 kids that were older growing up, and so we were all very close. I think there was 4 of us in 5 years, and then we adopted 2 other of my 2 other brothers later on. But the 4 of us were very close, and so I think my own experience also kind of resonated with these children in a way. And Edmund really did kind of play out in the way that my brother played out in our life. And Lucy was very much like my sister Chelsea. Katie was very much like the older sister. And I was, in my own mind, very much like Peter, obviously. And so I think it's interesting that we make these connections with these individuals. And especially as I read this again for the first time, I went, man, boy, that really does feel like my childhood. The way we would argue about mom and dad when they would send us to bed, how we would talk about other individuals. I like him, I don't like him. And the personalities that are coming forth in this is truly something fascinating just to watch. And don't miss that as you're reading or as you're listening. Don't miss the personalities that come to life from these children, because they're different. They're all unique in their own way, and you may resonate more with one than the other. In fact, there may be some who resonate more with Edmund in his rebellion, in his stubbornness, and you may find yourself in that situation more so than the other children. And don't look at this just as, well, Edmund was the one that was kind of the problem in the end, when you realize that Aslan didn't care about that in the end. Aslan was still willing to give himself up in those moments. So I think it's fascinating for us to look at the personalities and maybe try to find one that you relate to in those ways. Now, specifically, when he talks about that, when you get to this point in time, it says about 10 minutes walk from here down to the dining room and any amount of stairs and passages in between. I think there's truly something fascinating about the size of this place. They talk about this home as if it's just grandiose. It's incredibly large. And the interaction symbolizes kind of this transition at times for me from childhood's imposed limits to the potential freedoms of adolescence and adulthood, where individuals begin to test the waters of self-governance. They see this new place, even though it has walls and parameters, suddenly is like a grand adventure to explore everything, and they see it's a new world before them, whereas they would have been in their house back in London, and now suddenly they're in the countryside, and they want to explore everything, and everything seems like it's a mile away, and it's just a vast world. In fact, Peter's confidence in the house's vastness and the absence of immediate oversight, which, by the way, fascinates me, underscores the idea that freedom often comes with the realization that many constraints are self-imposed or perceived rather than real, inviting a reflection on how much of our behavior is shaped by fear of consequence versus genuine moral or rational choice. And so I kind of want to ask the question, how often do you don't do something out of fear, as opposed to thinking about it just of that's right or that's wrong? I'll just think about from a perspective of evangelism. How often we think, do I share the gospel with this person? Do I tell them about Jesus? And how often we might find ourselves going, I'm just kind of afraid of what they're going to say, as opposed to not even possibly contemplating the fact that God told us a command, go into all the world sharing the gospel with all people. So the command is for us to go, the command is for us to share with our lives, but we've made evangelism into just this kind of premise of, well, if I say, do you know Jesus, as opposed to me actually being able to word out loud my faith or express it in some way. We struggle with these things. And are we thinking about whether right or wrong, or are we just afraid of what might happen if maybe it's just a normal consequence of our day? It's fascinating to me, this moral insight, this kind of premise. And so I'm kind of inviting you to reflect a little bit on what it means to be shaped by fear versus knowing if something is right or wrong. Am I called to do what is right or wrong, no matter the consequences? If I know it's right, no matter the consequences, I am called to do it. Versus, I'm just kind of being shaped by it. I'm not even thinking about the moral implications. Do I explore this house? May seem like an odd thing to say, but the reality is do I go into all the world? Do I go into the place that God has set forth, whether it's my work, my job, my family life, or whatever it may be, and actually share the gospel? Or am I not even thinking about whether or not I should be doing that or not, because I've allowed fear to kind of overcome my actual rational thought in those moments? he goes into this concept, and I love this next little part because they go into talking about birds. And I love birds. My wife loves birds, and so she can name just about every bird as we walk along. She'll hear a certain sound from a bird, and she'll tell me exactly what it is, and I know that she learned that from her grandmother. And so they go on and talk about all these adventures and thoughts, and there's badgers and foxes and rabbits, and they're so excited about all these things, and they can't wait to explore this world. And this is kind of why I want to mention this kind of moral insight. This moment invites kind of a philosophical contemplation on perception, reminding us that our visions of the future or interpretations of the present are often clouded by external circumstances beyond our control. It underscores the theme that true clarity or understanding might require patience, waiting for the rain to clear, suggesting that while we can anticipate and imagine, the true nature of things reveals itself in its own time, not ours. So they were imagining this whole world where they were going to explore this huge house, and they were going to go into all the woods, and there was going to be badgers and foxes and all these great things. And then the rain came and they were stopped. And while I really love the idea of the exploration, as I talked about earlier, of learning to what parameters have we set in our own life where we're not doing the things we've been called to do and we've lost our sense of wonder, but here also to understand that there are moments of just wait. And can I be honest, some of y'all may be in a time of waiting right now. Some of y'all may be in a moment where God is saying, sit, rest, wait. And can I tell you, that's a really hard thing to sit through. I'm always amazed how often God brings people through the storm. And it's through the storm. It's not always around the storm, or He doesn't always calm the storm, but it's through the storm. And with that in mind, George MacDonald uses the terminology sacred idleness, learning to sit and wait for God. And that's a hard one. And I'll be honest with you, there may be some tonight that's the struggle. That's where you're at right now, is learning to sit and wait for the rain to clear before you can step forth again. I know that's hard. And I want you to know that you're probably just in the chat and the rest, you can probably even mention it. You're not alone in this. You're not alone in going through this. And I love that Lewis kind of gives this perception, because while there is this waiting, even within the waiting, God is going to work. Even within the waiting, the narrative doesn't stop. In fact, even through the storms is where we're going to find the great wonders and adventures that's going to grow these children from this point forward. And of course, he goes in and talks about there's all these books and all these places and all these wonderful things around. At any point in time, you can go back and just kind of pause this along the way, and you will be able to read the chapters in the same way. They're going off to explore different ways, and they find suits of armors and beautiful spare bedrooms and incredible things. And then one of my favorite terminology says most of them very old books and some bigger than a Bible in a church. There's a reason for this, because it used to be individuals didn't have individual Bibles back in the day. The local church would have a very large print Bible, very, very large print, and it would usually be chained to the front of the church. And so people would go in and actually then not be able to read it, but it would have to be read for them. We don't think of it in that same way. So the Bible was, in those days, the biggest book most people had ever seen. And there were so many books and so many places. And all of this is setting a scene of a house filled with wonder and filled with joy and filled with new things to learn and new things to grow in. And it's fascinating the way that it plays itself out there. And then there is this little moment where she steps into this door and they find themselves inside a room with nothing but a wardrobe. Nothing but a wardrobe. Oh, and this is where all the great adventures begin. Now, I should note here right at the end, it says, because she knew, or she immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it is very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Now, this is an interesting thing, and the reason for this is quite funny. Over and over again, when he first wrote the book, one of the biggest recommendations he kept getting from people was, you have to say, kids, do not close the door in the wardrobe, because otherwise there will be an epidemic of kids who will go into wardrobes all across the UK and all across America when this book is printed, trying to get through wardrobes, and they will lock themselves into wardrobes and children will be killed. And that was this great worry that kept happening from publishers over and over again. And so Lewis ended up, I don't know how many times, I should go back and count, I think it's like 11, 12, 13 times he specifically notes, because she knew that it is very foolish to shut oneself into a wardrobe, trying to warn warn all of these devastated kids that would be out there to not shut yourself into a wardrobe, because that would be a very bad thing. And so this moment kind of encapsulates the tension between security and adventure, suggesting at times that true discovery often requires us to step outside of our comfort zones, to embrace the unknown, not out of recklessness, but from a place of curiosity and an intuitive sense that there might be something more beyond the immediate. Lucy's open door policy reflects a balance between exploration and caution, hinting that while we venture into new realms, we should perhaps keep a connection to our origins, a reminder of where we came from as we explore where we might go. Now, spiritually speaking, let me just share this with you. I always tell people I'm never afraid of questions, and I know God's not afraid of mine. God's not afraid of my questions, but God does expect me to hold on to the things that I know to be true. He does expect me to hold on to truth. And I've seen a lot of students and people over the last couple of years go through the process of what they would often term deconstructing their faith, or breaking down their faith, or reevaluating their faith. In fact, I can't tell you how many times I see churches that'll bring up and they'll say, well, we're going to start doing a reevaluation of certain subjects. And I already know what it means, because within a year, they will have changed the entire thing. They'll say, we're going to go restudy this and the rest. And most of the time, they have negated or left behind that which they once held dear. But to hold on to that which is true, while also being willing to face that which we don't know, the adventures that are there. And I do think there has to be a balance with that. One hand looking to the future, one holding firm to that which is the truth that is God's word, the truth that is God's wisdom, the truth that is found in those things. And so I do think that there has to be a balance between those two. And I love that this insight over and over, the way he just keeps having to say, don't forget, keep the door open, don't lock yourself in, is this sense of don't be reckless in your pursuit of things, but always keep firmly hold of God as you seek for answers in this world. So as she goes further in, she starts feeling the change of everything. And man, it goes from a wardrobe very quickly, a cupboard, into now it's starting to be a little bit cold, and there's crunching under her feet, and there's this imagery that Lewis uses where you can feel yourself walking through in the same way, going, what is going on? And in fact, when he starts mentioning even the cold, you kind of feel a little bit cold as you're pulling through, and you think about those fur coats, because the fur coats might make you feel warm, and then you walk in a little bit further, and it's just getting a little bit colder, and then prickly. And his use of terminology to me is just it's beautiful in and of itself. It's great writing, because he even notes that Nook's money she found when she was rubbing against her face, and hands were no longer soft fur, but of something hard and rough and even prickly. Maybe you can even picture tree branches that were coming across her face in those moments. And then she says, why is it just like the branches of trees? And then there's, in the middle of this, snowflakes falling through the air. It's this beautiful imagery of winter, where she has come from a rainy day inside of a wardrobe, and now she's in a winter season, cold and soft, falling around her. This change in scenery, and I hope you even see it in the intro and outro video that I've created, will show you, make you feel a little bit about what it was to feel that transition of, I'm not in, you go back and kind of like the old saying, we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. It's one of those. And Lucy suddenly found herself, and if you notice again, very silly to shut oneself in a wardrobe. He notes it again, finds herself in this wood, and she looks back, and she still can see just that little light in the door. This act of leaving the door ajar symbolizes kind of the wisdom of maintaining a lifeline to reality. I love curiosity and thinking outside, but I often have to remind myself to come back to reality. I'm a dreamer. I love dreaming big and thinking big about all the things that are going on in life, but I have to come back to reality at times, because I can create a lot of different things if I just kind of chase after rabbits, which, by the way, this is why this study is called the Rabbit Hole Study. I love chasing rabbits, but at the same time, realizing and remembering that which is truth versus just that which is new. It underscores this idea that true courage and exploration isn't just about diving headfirst into the new, but also about keeping a mindful connection to the known, embodying a deep understanding of truth versus the new. This is something I have to constantly remind myself of. As she keeps going, she finds a lamppost, and I love this lamppost. And I don't know why it's there, but it seems to be just this guiding light, this light to the way home, which I do think is an imagery that Lewis is giving, specifically tied to Genesis 1. It's tied to John. It's tied to the Gospels as Jesus is the light. All of these, over and over again, it's this guiding way home. And I do think that there's something powerful to that. Also, as she's coming through this, she starts to hear this pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And this comes back to the original reason why Lewis first wrote this book, from what he writes. It's that he had this imagery of a fawn, and this is where she's introduced to the fawn. And this description of the fawn, as it's written out, brings everything to life for me in my mind. And I don't know if you're a visual learner or a visual person in general, and maybe you need some imagery that will show you what these things look like. Obviously, they're mythical creatures. A fawn was nothing new to mythological writings that people had written about him before and the rest, but the way that Lewis writes about him, you can kind of see him come to life, the way he holds his tail, the packages, and then also the umbrella over him, and the red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too, and the strange but pleasant little face. I love these little details that he gives along the two horns on each side of his head. And I do love that the first words we hear from this fawn are, "Goodness gracious me," as he drops the parcels in surprise at seeing Lucy standing there. This little moment kind of invites a philosophical reflection on the nature of surprise, the limits of our understanding, and the potential for profound change or revelation when confronted with the truly novel. To me, it suggests that true growth or enlightenment often comes not from familiar, but from the encounters that jolt us out of our complacency, forcing us to reconsider our place in the universe. I love surprise. And I can tell you this because there have been a lot of moments where I've heard people say, I was reading my Bible and I came across something that I had not caught before. And that's so true, these little moments of surprise. Now, I've also had people who said, I was reading my Bible and I saw something new. Anytime somebody uses that terminology, I always try to make sure I understand what they're saying first. I don't think there's anything new. I do think there's always something more, that the scriptures always have more depth or more connections or more things for us. It's a never-ending source of wisdom. I don't believe there's ever a moment where you can go, yep, I've figured it out, I've got it all. In fact, that's an unbelievably dangerous way to live spiritually in this world. But to catch that first thing, in fact, we had a young man recently who was baptized just a few months ago. Who's one of our young professionals here, runs a supermarket here. Fantastic young man. And I remember he did first time he did a devotional for us, and he said, I had never read, then we were talking about the parables. He said, I never read this parable before. And as I read it, it was just fantastic. It was amazing. And I told him, I said, I was jealous of the fact that he got to read it for the first time. And that first time, that little moment of surprise, it was just like, oh, yeah, that little moment of something just a little bit deeper. And I'll tell you, the way that you get this, it's not just because you read it for the first time, but the beauty of the Bible is that every time you read it, there's something new. Not new to us, but new in the sense that God can often reveal his will and his way deeper from his word. Now, I don't believe God changes his word, but God has said what he has said, and there's beauty in finding that and staying in his word over and over and over again. There's just wonders to be found through his word. So, that's chapter 1. That's where we're going to end this evening. I am so grateful for you having joined. If you tuned in, wherever you're from, make sure you let me know where you're coming from. Thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. If you're watching after the fact, please do the same. Let me know. If you've got questions or thoughts, comments about certain passages or certain things along the way, I'd love to know about them. Love to read. Look forward to going and reading your comments after the fact. So incredibly grateful. As always, if I can do anything for you, please reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to serve you in whatever way I can. I love you all. Hope you have a fantastic, fantastic week, and we'll see you next Thursday night with Chapter 2. If you're looking ahead of time and want to listen, the YouTube video, it's already up for Chapter 2. You can go and listen at any time. Until then, have a wonderful, wonderful night.